Pokémon FireRed and LeafGreen. These games acted as a vehicle to pull Generation 1 of Pokémon into a more modern experience. Despite there only being around 5 years between the original Red and Blue release and these remakes, there's a sizable difference, mainly because handheld gaming technology moved so quickly during that time, but also because Pokémon itself exploded in popularity and experienced a lot of general upscaling in its world building and mechanics and everything in between. But these particular remakes seem to divide opinion more than most, so I thought I'd go back and experience them again, and give my 2 cents on them. So let's do that. We're back in Kanto again, for Pokémon FireRed and Pokémon LeafGreen. I mentioned the upscaling from the original Red and Blue games, and a good place to start is the Kanto region itself. With the aesthetics of the Pokémon world being much further fleshed out in Gen 2 and Gen 3 games, Kanto can now have a bit of a facelift. The region got a new lick of paint in the Gen 2 games when we travelled there for the post-game, but it wasn't a Kanto region that was centre stage. Here we can really see where locations have been given not just a lick of paint, but entire new palettes, and a lot more life and character. I think this improved most locations. I really like locations like Vermilion City and Celadon City, which look far more lively and seem to have this extra pop to them. The much higher saturation of the Gen 3 titles probably had a lot to do with that too. And Viridian Forest even does a stellar job of maintaining that dense, almost claustrophobic vibe. It also fails to hit the mark in some places though. The main one that comes to mind for me is Lavender Town. This location is supposed to be spooky. It's supposed to evoke a feeling of dread. It was unsettling in the originals, even though it was on much more limited hardware. It's a Pokémon graveyard. We're not supposed to get good vibes from this town. There's just none of that in these remakes. It feels more like the Lavender Town of the Gen 2 post-game. I think maybe it's just too bright. It needed a foggy filter over it or something. It just does not radiate the same atmosphere as the originals. And that was a huge letdown for me, because it's such an iconic town in the Pokémon world. I feel like there were a lot of visual and environmental upgrades that came in Gen 3 that weren't passed along to these games. Could we have not had, for example, a few flakes of ash raining down on Cinnabar Island to foreshadow the eruption that eventually happens? Rainy weather on Cycle Road is a reference to the Cycle Road episode in the anime. And look, I've long since made peace with the day-night cycle being absent in Gen 3, but yeah, that too. That would have been nice. So I'm pretty conflicted. I do think this is overall the best version of Kanto we have in a Pokemon game right now. That could be quite controversial to say, because a lot of people really love Let's Go's art style, and that's more than justifiable. But these games just about win that battle for me. Overall, these games do capture the distilled charm of Kanto pretty well. The problem just arises when you compare Kanto to other regions, because now you don't have that excuse of, well, Kanto was on the OG Game Boy. It's been brought up to a new generation, and comparing Gen 3's Kanto to Gen 3's Hoenn, it's still quite bare-boned. And coming here after playing the Gen 3 titles, it's you versus the guy she tells you not to worry about. You're not going to be blown away by Kanto. As for the story elements of these games, they're very faithful to the originals. They clearly wanted this to be Pokémon Red and Blue for a new audience, and some heavy nostalgia for an older audience. There were a few teeny tiny tweaks to dialogue I noticed throughout the game, but they were few and far between, and didn't change the context of anything. There's also the addition of the Sevi Islands post-game section, but I'm going to give that its own video. Because you know what? I have never played the post-game of FireRed LeafGreen, so that'll be a fun one to navigate. But yeah, nothing new to report on the story. These games seem to be fully focused on delivering a strictly faithful Kanto experience, just with all the world building and strategic enhancements of the Generation 3 engine. I kinda wish they'd done more. There's no arguing that Kanto has the most basic plot in Pokémon, because they were the first ever games. With more to play with in terms of hardware and aesthetics and mechanics, I just think it was a missed opportunity to jazz this region up, to put it on a level with Johto and Hoenn. Speaking of things that were carried across from Generation 3, the biggest impact there was created by the mechanics. So firstly, The Gen 3 quality of life features that were ported across the Kanto here are fantastic. Running shoes, a smoother surfing experience, move deleter. There's no denying that we're getting a much more comfortable experience here. Also, there's the addition of Pokemon types we didn't have in the originals, like Steel and Dark. Dark type was pretty huge actually, because Psychic types were practically unrivaled in Red and Blue, thanks to a coding error with Ghost types. Sabrina isn't quite the monolith she was now. Abilities and natures are also adding extra layers to the battling in FireRed LeafGreen, along with new attacks that weren't in the originals, so you have better customization and creativity for your team building. More things are possible. But also, it kind of throws the intended difficulty off-center in places. A quick example I've heard a couple of people mention before is Charmander learning Metal Claw at level 13. Usually, choosing Charmander is putting you in a tough spot for the first couple of gyms. It's like the challenge mode starter. But the first gym is a piece of cake now, because it now learns a super effective move before you get there. And for returning players that hadn't played a Pokemon game since Red and Blue, there would have been a fair learning curve with these new mechanics too. Learning that the Dugtrio you caught in Diglett Cave is now ineffective against the ghosts in Lavender Tower, because they have the Levitate ability now. Pokemon that were usually slower in battle could have a nature that increases their speed now, and that could catch you out. Despite this though, the games are much more user-friendly in the big picture, and they're an easier ride, which was needed probably. We weren't quite at the point we are nowadays where a game needs to be constantly barreling forwards to keep people's attention, but have you gone back and played Pokemon Red or Blue recently? They are a toil. They were clearly meant to be a slow burn. Streamlining that experience was always far more likely to pull people back in for another ride, even if it does mean tripping the player up a few times with modern mechanics. It isn't just us that benefits from the updated move pools though, because the gym leaders also get a bit of a buff. Things like Misty's Starmie now having Recover makes it a tad trickier to take down. All of Koga's Pokemon now knowing Toxic, not just his Wheezing. That's fun to deal with. So there's balance there. And again, it emphasised the need to come at these games with a fresh mindset. But also, that's very hard to do if you've played the originals. Because obviously you're going to be like, oh, I remember that part, I should prepare these kinds of Pokemon for it. And then the newer mechanics barge in and throw you off. So there's an argument there that these titles would have been better off not selling themselves as a faithful Gen 1 experience. Because you could potentially end up very frustrated when things aren't what you remember them to be. Remember, we're not talking about a remake coming out a decade later like the Johto remakes or the Hoenn remakes. This was 5 years depending on where you live. The originals were probably still fresh in your mind. I still enjoyed this playthrough. I'll be honest, I forget a lot of things anyway, so that kinda makes it feel fresh. You know, actually, I realised that I could never truly be accused of being a Gen 1er, because while playing through these games, I entered Seafoam Islands without getting the Strength HM first, completely forgot about the whole Warden's Teeth thing in the Safari Zone. It took me a while to figure out the Pokemon Mansion, and I got comically lost in Victory Road, for long enough that I simply stopped recording and consulted an online guide. I started with Pokemon Red and Blue, and I realised here that Kanto is one of the generations I kinda remember the least about. I mentioned that I'm going to make a separate video about the postgame of these titles, because I've never played it before, but we do have a bit of a preamble in this postgame area during the base game. Once we defeat Blaine's gym on Cinnabar Island, Bill drags us on a brief adventure to this area, where we end up getting tasked with finding a lost little girl called Lostelle. I could not stop laughing at her name. That is ludicrously on the nose, even for Pokemon. But it looks like there is a fair chunk of content here, so I'm looking forward to experiencing that for the first time, so keep an eye out for that video. I find myself more conflicted with these games than I have been with other remakes I've played, mainly because I don't really know what they added to the Kanto experience, other than the graphic enhancements and, at the time, modern mechanics and quality of life features. Pokemon FireRed and LeafGreen feel like they were made for the sake of keeping Pokemon top of mind for people. I mean, we are talking about a time where Pokemania had tailed off. The franchise was in this strange place where it couldn't coast on that early hype anymore. The series had to evolve, if you'll excuse the phrasing. But instead, they chose to churn out a nostalgic plod of an experience with these games. It's faithful at its core, You'll recognise all the same beats, but the mechanical changes also force you to somehow try to approach the games like you've never played them before. You know what's coming, but also you can't be 100% sure. They could have done so much more with these games, but their insistence on being so rigidly faithful to Red and Blue kinda stumped them in my view. Despite all this, FireRed and LeafGreen are still my favourite way to experience Kanto. And to this day, I still think we need another Kanto game that truly brings this region into the modern landscape. Not a nostalgia trip, not a faithful rehash, but something that entirely reimagines the region and its culture and its story. But anyway, why don't you go ahead and tell me your thoughts on Pokémon FireRed and LeafGreen? This has been a kinda choppy video, because as I said, compared to the other remakes, there's not nearly as much I have to say about them. The post-game is the thing I'm mainly looking forward to. But if you've played them, did you enjoy FireRed and LeafGreen? Are they at all games you come back to? Let me know all your thoughts down in the comments as always. While you're down there, please do drop a like on the video, helps out massively. Subscribe for more Pokemon content. Join the Discord if you'd like to chat. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next one.